Luke, we began several weeks ago where Luke told us in the prologue of the gospel that he authored, his purpose for writing is so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. He's told us that when he's writing this, doing this research, doing the writing, his purpose is to give this narrative to a young man by the name of Theophilus, that he would know for a certainty the truth of the things that he's been taught. So let's just quickly go back through this thing. I want to take a quick run through. For 30 years, Jesus, who is God, lived on earth. He lived amongst us. The only remarkable thing about the first 30 years of Jesus' life is how insignificant and how mundane and how just very plain it was. He was just a little boy, grew up in a scrabble little village called Nazareth, dealing with the regular daily activities of life. Sometime along that period of time, his earthly father passed away. And so his mother raised him. And Jesus then, as the oldest, the firstborn in the family, had that responsibility. So when at 30 years old, which typically in a Jewish family is the coming of age, Jesus leaves home. He leaves his siblings, he leaves his mother, he makes his way down to the Jordan River where he's going to be baptized by a man who is his cousin who's lately come on the scene and has been known as being a preacher, rather fiery preacher. His name is John. He baptizes, so he was known as John the Baptizer. Now, as he makes this trip, there's a sense of anticipation, somewhat uncertain to be sure, but doesn't know what these new developments are going to be, but there's the anticipation of a ministry that's about to begin, an announcement that's about to be made. And the teaching and the preaching of this new guy named Jesus causes a lot of people to take note. There's a growing enthusiasm. Some people even dared to think that this new guy might be the Messiah. And to mention that in a Jewish community, it's electrifying to think that their Messiah has come. It was so electrifying that a few people even left their vocation. They left their life behind. We were told of some, especially some women who were fairly well off, and they were able to follow with Jesus and be a part of his entourage and to help with supporting. Some people, others, were specifically called. Their name, Jesus prayed about them, and he called them by name, and he says, I want you to be my disciples. Later, these whom he called, they became known as apostles, the ones who were sent out. So following 30 years of quiet comes a time of real excitement, astonishment, wonder, even amazing signs. There's incredible miracles performed. People who were blind from birth were made able to see. Some who had been crippled, then their legs and so forth were healed, and they were able to not just walk, but to jump for joy. The dumb were made to speak. The sick are healed. Demons and that whole spiritual world which so many of us are very unfamiliar with, but demons were cast out of people who had been so possessed by them. But I think what's one of the most amazing, excuse me, I think one of the most amazing and astonishing things is this, is to watch a man walk up to a person who is dead, taking him out to be buried. And Jesus tells him, son, rise up. And he does. He does. There's got to be something that's important about that. There's got to be something that says to us, this one named Jesus, he's different. He's not like the run-of-the-mill prophets. Because when he speaks, there's truth, but when he does, what he does is incredibly amazing. So, as would be typical, this is why I don't shake hands afterwards. I'm not being rude. I've just been coughing in my hands for a week now, and so you just don't want to shake hands. We'll fist or whatever, but and I have this rattle in my lung, and it won't go away. I got to get out of my bike and pump it out, I think. Right, Chi-Chi? Okay. So these crowds begin to grow. There's a curiosity. There's a wonder. The crowds come not only to see the things that Jesus does, but they focus in on his teaching because he's teaching about a new kingdom. The kingdom has come, the kingdom of God. And again, in the Jewish mindset, in the Jewish culture, when you begin talking about this kingdom, immediately what comes to mind is the great kingdom of David and Solomon and their great heritage. They're looking for this to return, and every single Jew today is looking for the return of their kingdom. These crowds grow, however, the attitude begins to change. We see that Jesus doesn't behave like people expect him to behave. They have a certain expectation for how they want the Messiah to conduct himself. Jesus doesn't always conduct himself that way. As we saw a couple of weeks ago, he goes and visits in the home of a Pharisee, one of the religious people. And in visiting in that guy's home, man, he calls him out. He calls him a hypocrite. He says that your heart is full of greed and wickedness. So you might think again about asking Jesus to come to your house unless you're going to be straight with him, because he's going to be very straight with us. He sees and he knows where we're at, and he'll call us out on that. So as this unexpected behavior, and then the other thing that really bothered him was unacceptable associations. When he called out Matthew, who was a tax collector, to be one of his close party, who was going to write the Gospel of Matthew and to be one of the apostles, one of the sent ones, that didn't sit well with the religious type at all. I mean, he's a tax collector. And tax collectors were generally known as being cheats, generally known as being greedy. So when we come to chapter 11, powerful people are beginning to take notice. What used to be a very happy and exciting time just hanging out with Jesus, now these powerful people are taking notice, and they're not so happy. The religious right, sounds political, I know, but the religious right cannot accept the lack of understanding on Jesus' part. Doesn't he know he's not supposed to hang out with these sinners? They called him, the religious right called Jesus a glutton. They called him a drunkard. He was neither. But these were the words they used because Jesus didn't fit the mold of their expectations. He didn't live a life of holiness. He didn't live a life of separation like the Pharisees did, and even with the washing of the hands and everything that they did. He just didn't fit the mold. And so some of them, of the previously adoring crowd, they began to turn against Jesus. They began to demand more of him. They wanted more of his magical tricks. They wanted more to satisfy their curiosity. But Jesus doesn't accommodate anyone except sinners. The only people that Jesus accommodates are those who come humbly to him and say, I need a Savior. I believe you, Jesus. I believe you that you are the Son of God. And sinners who come to him, he gladly welcomes them. You'll see in the next chapter when we get in there in Luke, there's a phrase in there that absolutely astounds me. That as the crowds of people who had gathered around him begin to disperse because they're not comfortable around him, guess who takes their place? The sinners. The sinners. And as a pastor, I think to myself time and time again, why are we not attractive to sinners like Jesus was? Sinners were drawn to him, and he drew sinners to him. Would that we would be like him. Jesus fails with respects to how he should behave as a Messiah. There's this increasing spiritual opposition to where he's accused then of being in league with Beelzebul. Beelzebul is the lord of the demons. He's accused of being in cahoots with darkness and evil spirits. And then, as we saw, he trades these insults with the religious and the legal crowd. So he's getting some powerful enemies. It's getting hot. It's getting difficult. It's not so cool hanging out with Jesus anymore. You got to make that decision. Opposition breaks out into the open. And when he has this conversation with the Pharisees and the gloves come off. And so you see when the gloves come off, you see the soft, silky hands of the religious type, and they say, "Okay, Jesus, we're going to fight you." But it gets serious. They begin to make false accusations. Many thousands of people jam together. Jesus outright points to the blatant hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and then he tells his disciples, he says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." These guys, these religious types, they're empty talkers. They talk, they take no action. They're like dressing on dead bones. They'll put burdens on other people, things they won't do themselves, and they'll not even lift a finger to help people to keep all the rules and so forth that they've designed for them. Hanging out with Jesus is becoming increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly uneasy. So then, when we come to chapter 12, Jesus speaks to his followers. He wants to tell them what true followers will have to face, what true followers will have to do. It's not a very pretty picture, actually. But he does call on them to step up. He calls on them to be identified. He tells them that things that are said in private, they're going to be made known. There's not going to be any hiding. There's not going to be any pretending. There's not going to be any secrets. And that's, my friend, if I might say again, is the significance of baptism. It's an open coming out and saying, guess what? I'm identified with Jesus. I'm identified with the notorious death of the cross, his burial in the his burial in the ground, and his resurrection again to new life. My friends, own it. Own that identity. Don't hide who you are. Do not come out and confess Jesus Christ and live for him. Caution. Don't make a confession of Christ and then live like the world. If you're going to be a Christian, if you're going to identify with Jesus, then make it your goal to live like Jesus. Because one thing is very sure. There are no pretenders with God. There are no pretenders with God. You might be able to fool everyone else, but I'm promising you, you won't fool God. Jesus meets his disciples in the middle of a restless crowd, and he says, watch out for the Pharisees. Watch out for hypocrisy. He makes it very clear. It's not about pretense. It's not about appearances. It's not a hypocrisy, being something you're not. But it's a clear acknowledgement before others of your allegiance to the Son of Man. That is what's called for. The Son of Man will do in heaven. He'll do in heaven in relation to you what you are prepared to do on earth in relation to him. If we'll take a stand for him in this world, he will stand for us when we stand before him. Maybe one of the reasons our prayers are not answered is because we don't take that stand. We haven't made that identity. Which life do you want? A life dependent on the promises and the things of this world, a life of the things that say you can have this, you can have more, you can do all these things? Or do you want a life that has no guarantees of anything in this world but the guarantee of life forever with Jesus Christ, with him? You see, too often our sight becomes very tunnel. We have this tunnel vision. We think only of the things in this world. You're here 70 years, 80 years. Some might even live to 90 years or 100. What is that in light of eternity? What is that in light of eternity? Speaking of which, you know we have time zones in this world? 24-hour time zones. If you've flown on an airplane, you know what I mean, okay? You know what time it is now in California. Don't worry about it. It's daylight savings time. You have to think it all over again. Here's my point. Only a little over 200 years ago, none of that was there. 200 years. 200 years. And that's such an important part of our time now. Time has a beginning and time has an end. Time is a measurement. A measurement always has something where it starts and where it ends. We're not going to be in this world. We're not going to be within the specter of time. And yet we are so caught up with schedules and regulations and so forth and the things of this world. what will we choose? It's a tough question, honestly, for many of us. It's a tough question, especially for people who call ourselves followers of Jesus. I'll tell you why. Because we expect the guarantee of a good job if we work hard and do good work in school. We expect a certain level of material wealth as our due reward for hard work. I mean, I know we expect it because every one of us teaches that to our kids, right? I know, you don't have to shake your head. I know that because I was one. The thing is this, and listen to me very carefully when I say this. We hope that a closeness to God happens. We want a closeness to God to happen in our life. But it's not as if we really deeply yearn for Him because we're so caught up with the things of this world. We're not willing to let go. Jesus demands an honest assessment of our allegiance. The question is, what are you willing to get rid of? What are you willing to get away to do away with in order that you might have the closeness of a dear relationship with God? So after that dinner he had with the Pharisees, he gives some advice to his disciples. He tells them this, hey, nothing's covered. Everything's going to be revealed. Nothing hidden that will not be made known. Here's the thing. Here's what Jesus is saying, and this is a theme that Luke goes over and over again, and I'm reviewing this to bring us up to where we're going to go today. Darkness it keeps us from seeing the truth. Light reveals the truth. But here's the thing. There's clearly a relationship between fear and the unknown. Basically, in fact, as researchers will tell us, that the majority of our fears are about something we really don't know. We don't know. If we're worried about tomorrow, it's because we don't know about tomorrow. However, there's also this relationship between the unknown and darkness. Why are people afraid of the dark? Because you can't see in the dark. Once the lights come on and you see where you're at, you don't need to be afraid. Or on the other hand, you might be completely afraid. So that's why there's this tug of war that goes on between darkness and light. All we need to do is to turn on the light and the darkness will flee. But that leads to the problem of fear in our lives. Fear has a huge, I don't think we recognize how great a presence fear has upon us and the influence that fear has. Let me read this quote. Fear controls too much of life. Afraid that we will not please others, we become hypocrites. Afraid of those in power, we forfeit our integrity. That's good to remember in this election, by the way, if you're from the country that's having the election. Afraid of ridicule, we deny Jesus. Afraid of poverty and want, and we deify our wealth. Afraid of death and suffering, we lose trust in God. Afraid we've missed our opportunity, we're not ready when God calls us then. Afraid we'll not get all that is coming to us. We take things into our own hands rather than waiting to accept the reward that God has prepared for us. He promised. Afraid of what our family will think. So we let our family loyalty override loyalty to God. Jesus seeks to lead us to trust God and overcome all fear. Jesus seeks to lead us to trust God and overcome all fear. That's why there's this thing about fear, and that's why Luke talks about it. And later on in this later passage of chapter 12, Alex will talk about it. He says, don't be anxious, don't be afraid. Let me just tell you what's going to happen. Next week, my friend Mike Robinette is going to preach. And then Alex is going to take up the theme here in Luke for a couple of weeks. And then Mike Everett's also going to speak. And what am I going to do? I'm going to listen. But the question is, what will it take for God? What will it take for us to trust God more than we trust what we see in this world, what we sense in this world? I ask the question, is there an unwillingness to be a witness of Jesus' work and his influence in my life? We could ask if there's an unwillingness to tell others about Jesus in our life, then maybe we should ask, are we truly believers? If we're unwilling to acknowledge the role of Jesus Christ and what he's done in our life. So that's why we talked last week about full disclosure. Fully disclosing, fully making known our identity with Jesus Christ and who he is, and just living that life. Our attention becomes so focused on the short term that we miss the long. We miss the eternity. You see, we're greatly influenced and moved by people, aren't we? Aren't we? Yeah, you can nod your head. We're so caught up by what people think rather than what God thinks. It's a fear of people rather than a fear of God. Life on this earth is not what is most important. Life on this earth is not what is most important. But you wouldn't know that by the way that we're so frustrated in how we need to get ahead in life. It's usually the most urgent, it's usually the most demanding upon us, but it is not the most important. Eternity is our destination. That deserves our focus. That deserves our attention. And so Jesus speaks about the one who, he says, be careful of the one, excuse me, to beware of the one who has power to determine your eternal destiny. He deserves our focus. Jesus is that one. So, what happens then when we really fear God? What effect does that have on us? What happens when we fear God? Well, first of all, we're less afraid of what people may think of us or do to us. And that's a good thing. That really is. I'll tell you what, it'll certainly make your life a whole lot more relaxed when you're not worried about what others think. The other thing that happens when we fear God is God suddenly becomes big. Big, big, big. And people are so much more smaller. It doesn't mean that we run roughshod over people. It doesn't mean that we don't care. It just means that we have our priorities right. We know where our focus and our attention is. We know where our dues need to go. We know that God is the one that we need to be thinking of and being concerned about. And just at this very moment, as Jesus is saying this, a young man jumps into the conversation. Then Jesus is interrupted with a request. It's even a demand. So we'll read these scriptures here. Luke chapter 12, beginning with verse 13 through verse 21. It's a story that Jesus shares with us. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, that's Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" I would really have liked to have heard the tone of voice in that, wouldn't you? Man, who made me a judge? Or man? We don't have that opportunity, but it certainly gives license for imagination. So Jesus said to them, he says to them, notice that in verse 15. He says to them, because verse 13 starts out with someone in the crowd. Now he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Hang that on your wall. And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool,'" this, again, I like the tone of voice on that. "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up a treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So this man jumps in, interrupts, and we have this little, I guess you could say, parentheses here, and he attempts to make Jesus a judge to decide the inheritance rights. Actually, Jesus doesn't have to be the judge. It's clearly written in the Old Testament that if you're the oldest one, you get double the inheritance. Since I'm the oldest, I think that's a great idea. However, the interesting thing about this, he's not really trying to get Jesus to make a judgment. What he is, you see, there's a lot of people in the crowd who recognize the authority of Jesus. They recognize that he speaks with authority. And so, like we do sometimes, they want to go running to Jesus and say, well, Jesus, you got the authority. You tell that person what to do. But when Jesus looks to us and says and tells us what to do, it's like, whoa. You know, I didn't ask you to do that. And too often, we'll go running off to God, we'll go running off to the Scriptures, and we'll say, hey, here's what it says, without applying it to ourselves first. And he needs to first to apply the authority of Jesus to his own life before he begins to apply it to someone else. However, because he doesn't himself want to submit to authority, he simply wants to use Jesus to get what he wants. We don't do that, do we? Of course not. Jesus refuses to make a legal judgment here. But he does make a moral judgment. Notice what he says in this next slide here. He says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. I got to tell you something, folks. If there's one thing that if there's one phrase that our world needs to hear from Jesus, it's this one. You'd have a hard time convincing me that this world isn't totally based on the abundance of our possessions. I got to notice that my iPhone 7 is ready for me. iPhone 7 is the fastest selling phone in Taiwan right now. It's just like hotcakes. I've had to wait 3 weeks to get one. Why? My 5 works fine. It looks ugly, but it works fine. But you see how this works, folks? Man, I am convinced I need it. You know why? It's waterproof. Now I don't have to wrap it in a plastic bag. I just go ride in the rain. So the whole thing is, we can convince ourselves of these things. But Jesus' moral statement is this: be on your guard against all covetousness. Why? Because that has nothing to do with the value of this life. There's nothing in this life that can make a difference on the value. Life does not consist in the abundance of the things that you have. And you know when this is really good? When you move house. Yeah, we have boxes in our storeroom we haven't opened since 6 years when we moved in. Jesus is saying, be careful, man. Your greed is showing. Your greed is showing. He's saying to him, stop, think. What's the quality of your life? It's not determined by the toys you own. The difference between the men and the boys is the toys. The price of their toys. Isn't that the truth? Life isn't made up. It's not determined by how many good toys we have. Our life is certainly more important. And Jesus is trying to get this thought across. Your life is more important than your possessions. Who you are is not decided by what you own. So he tells the story. He tells the story about this farmer. He takes an everyday story to present a spiritual truth. And by the way, as I was looking through this thing, I'm thinking, this guy's in our day and age, he would be very highly respected as being a very successful farmer, having done well. He's a wealthy farmer. He does his work well. He's got a good farm. Here comes a good year. He comes up with a bountiful harvest. Everything comes together. The weather, the land, the laborers, the good seed, and the fertilizing, the care of the plants. There's a healthy harvest. It all comes together to create just this abundance. And sometimes it happens like that in the business cycle too. Everything comes together and bam, your business just goes kaboom in a good way. May I say this? There is no condemnation here of the farmer for his hard work, his great results, and his wealth. Jesus in no way condemns this man or criticizes him because he's a wealthy person. We need to, there's a couple of false theologies out there. One false theology is, if you're a believer, God will bless you and make you rich. I know too many believers who are very poor, but happy. You need to go to visit a church in Nepal. People are dirt poor. Some of them don't even have water in their homes, but they have a joy in their heart. Then on the other hand, we have this idea that you can't be happy unless you are poor. God doesn't want you to be wealthy. Both of those are completely wrong. They're completely unscriptural. Building bigger barns is not the problem. Expanding the business is not a problem. He needed the room to receive the blessing. Here's what Solomon says about this. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 20. Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. He's saying it's wise. Here's a man who has saved up these things. He's treasured them. They're in his dwelling because he's been careful to keep them. A foolish man, he's got it, he spends it. And it's gone. You see, the problem is not the storing up. The problem is not the success. The problem is this. It's a spiritual poverty and a manifest spirit of greed and selfishness. Read again what the farmer says about what he's going to do. He says, "What shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops." And he said, "Here's what I will do. I will tear down my barns, build larger ones. There I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul." Completely true, isn't it? I mean, they are. They're all his. It's all his work. It's all his effort. It's everything that he's done. But he has a superabundance, and he's not thinking one whit about anyone else. It's showing a spirit of greed. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9 says, and this is Paul, as Paul is writing to a young man by the name of Timothy. He says, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare." Now, stop. Let me just say, those whose desire it is, this is their motivation, this is their impetus in life, that they should be rich. You know what? They fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For it's the love of money, it's the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Greed is the desiring of more and more. Greed is never being satisfied with what one has. Greed and idolatry go hand in hand. If there is a choice between God and more, greed chooses more. Greed chooses more. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, again, this is Paul writing to a church in Corinth that was having problems with wealth and so forth. He says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." He's saying that to this young man and telling this parable, he's saying people are greedy. And it's because they're only thinking that this is mine. So he gives some warning signs of a greedy spirit. Warning signs of a greedy spirit. Let me just give you three of them he gives here in the scriptures. When self-esteem is based on possessions. Luke chapter 12, verse 15, he says that it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. His self-esteem is based on the things that he has.
When we present ourselves as being somebody because of our possessions, not because of who we are. Because we're wealthy, because we live in great big houses, we have this huge amount of influence. When that's where our self-esteem is based, on these possessions, it's a sign of greed. It's a sign of greed. Then he goes on in the second sign is this: when a person's security is based on how much they are worth. When a person's security is based on how much they are worth. Look at, again, chapter 12, verse 19. It tells us, "And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods. You've laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Everything was based on his wealth. It's based on his bank accounts, based on his ability to have done all this. It was all about him. That's a sign of a greedy spirit, when a person's security is based on how much they're worth. Another sign of a greedy spirit is when the attitude is, excuse me again, when what's mine is mine. When what's mine is mine. It's all about me. In fact, this farmer needs to realize it's a gift from God. The wisest man in the world has a proverb for this. He says in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 19, "Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot, rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God." Rather than thanking God and thanking God for his blessings, he says, "Look at what I have done. This is my crops. This is my abundance. Now I'm going to spend it on myself for the rest of my life. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. I'm just going to relax." You know what the proverb is saying? He's saying here, "Also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them." Again, I want to say to you, there is nothing wrong with being wealthy. God uses it. But you know what? He wants us to enjoy it. We can't enjoy it when we think it's all about me. This is why Jesus, he gives us a way in which we know that everything is a gift from him. And he tells us, if you'll give this 10% to the work of God. Some people do it like this, and I think this is a great idea. 10% comes right off the top. It goes to their local church. Another 10% goes then into a place where you cannot touch it. You cannot touch it. And so then the rest then is for you to enjoy, to make the most of. You say, "Well, I don't have enough." Then get to work. Because we always say we don't have enough. That is a warning of a greedy spirit when we always say we do not have enough. Those are signs of a greedy spirit. Where does it come from? This is very interesting. I hadn't seen this before, but as I began to think about it, I thought, this makes a whole lot of sense. It's not exactly in this passage of Scripture, because what Jesus does now, he goes, beginning in verse 22, he begins to tell the specifics then of what not to worry about. Don't be anxious for this. The origin of greed, it's a fear that our needs will not be met. Hey, if I don't do this, man, I'm not going to get food on the table. I have to do this. I've got to get this bigger job. I've got to have this better work because I have to provide. It's a fear that our needs will not be met. So here's what Jesus goes on to say in the next passage, and I'm not going to tread on Alex's toes by any means. He'll figure it out when he preaches and have something to say. But in chapter 22 and chapter 12, verse 22, and he said to his disciples, "Therefore, I tell," and when therefore, you know what that therefore is there for? He just got telling the parable, okay? And so now he says, "Therefore I tell you, don't be anxious about your life, what you'll eat, or about your body, or what you're going to put on. For life is more than food, the body is more than clothing." Really? Go hungry much? I think it was couple weeks ago at the men's meeting, we saw a little clip from Francis Chan about how this works. And he says, this is how we do our offering with God. And he had a leg of chicken leg, right? And so this chicken leg is our income, and he took a bite out of it, and he says, God, you understand, I have my mortgage to pay, and I've got to take care of the things at home. He takes a big bite out, and he's chewing and so forth, and then he says, well, God, you understand, too, I've got to put food, on the table for my family. He takes another bite out of it, and he says, and then I've got to provide, we've got to have clothes and so forth. Takes another bite out of it, and takes another bite out of it. It's just left just a chicken bone there, and he says, here, God, this is for you. Throws it up there for God to have. And sometimes that's our idea, that God gets the leftovers. But here's the amazing thing, and this is what really was funny. The amazing thing is this. We think God sees that chicken bone and goes, oh, wow, look, cool, I get this. Like he's so pleased to get our leftovers. That's why he says here, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, or what you will put on. Life is more than food. I don't believe that. Do you? It is. Life is more than food. It's more than the body, and the body is more than clothing. But here's what fear does. Why is fear such an origin of greed? Because fear kills faith. Let me say that again. Fear kills faith. It happens every time. There's a story in the Bible. It's an amazing story about a guy named Peter. He's on a boat in the middle of the night with all the disciples. They're waiting for Jesus. Jesus told them to go to the other side, so they're rowing across the other side in the middle of the night, and they see this figure walking on the water. It scares the bejeebies out of them. They're just panicked. But Jesus says, hey, it's me. Don't be afraid. And unbelievably, this guy named Peter, he's very impetuous. He steps up to the side of the boat and he says, hey, if it's you, tell me to come walk to you on the water. And Jesus says, Leiba, come. And Peter gets out of the boat. Unbelievable. What an amazing faith. Gets out of the boat and he's walking towards Jesus, but then reality sets in. He goes, whoa, what am I doing here? And fear crushed his faith, and he began to sink. And Jesus reached out and grabbed him, and they were in the boat. And he says to Peter, oh, you of little faith. Really? He steps out of the boat in the middle of the night, but you know what it was? Fear overcame his faith. That's why fear is the origin of greed, because when our faith is destroyed, we can't trust God. We have to trust ourselves. I've got to do this. I can't do this God's way because God's way is not going to work. And so faith is crushed and shriveled up because of fear. Thirdly, what's the cure for greed? What's the cure for greed? Seek God's kingdom. A little bit later in Luke chapter 12, here's what he says in verse 31. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. And then he goes on, and in the next thing for the cure of greed, send it on ahead. Be rich toward God. Send it on ahead. Be rich toward God. Now, you say, you've probably heard this said, you can't take it with you, right? Huh? Well, can you or can't you? Have you ever seen somebody going to the graveyard with a U-Haul in the back, They say you can't take it with you. But while you can't take it with you, you can send it ahead. You can send it ahead. This is the opportunity we have to do that, to send things ahead. Look what he says here. This is good stuff, folks. You need to get hold of this. Luke chapter 12, verse 33. What does he say? sell your possessions, give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Really? You can do that? Have you ever thought about it like that? Investing in eternity? Investing in the future in heaven? Look at 1 Timothy. This is again Paul speaking. He says, they are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. What's the cure for greed? Seek God's kingdom. Be rich toward God. And thirdly, lead with generosity. Let that be our beginning, generosity. Let that be the beginning in honoring God. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty. See, it's nothing wrong having barns, folks. Nothing wrong at all. Your vats will be bursting with wine. But when he says, by honoring the Lord with our wealth, with our first fruits of all your produce. In our time, in our talents, in our finances, honor God with the best and give him what's first. So this man was rich, but he was a fool. God said to him, fool, you fool. Yeah, but it's not so funny when God says it. I can't imagine the worst words in the world were the worst words in the world to hear from God. Why, you fool? You don't get it? This night, your soul is required of you. Here's the thing, folks. Here's the thing. The rich fool did not realize that he owned nothing. He owned nothing. All he had, the air he breathes, the world he lives in, his own life, it was on loan and could be called in at any time. Folks, we have got to understand that. We have this idea, it's mine, I can do what I want to with it. God says, you fool, tonight, the farmer says, this wealthy man says, hey, I've got it, man. My retirement is pumped. It's to the max. I can relax now. Not only relax, I can eat, drink, and be merry. And what else would you want in retirement? Honestly. I'm done with the work stuff now. I got what I need, and I'm just going to soak it all in. And God says, you fool, you fool. You've got till tonight, and that's all. He thought he had control of his life. Luke was telling this story, and he's telling it to us. To his friend Theophilus, he says, order your life in accordance with the one thing that is eternal. That's God. In other words, let not greed for that which is temporary keep you from eternal treasure. Hang that up in the wall in your room. Put it on your mirror. Make it a statement in your life. Here's the farmer who thought he was rich. But the one who is really rich, the one who is really, really rich, is the one who is rich toward God. And how is that? He tells us. Live generously. Seek God's kingdom. Don't be moved or motivated by a fear of others. Fear God first. Being rich towards God begins by dying to self at the foot of the cross. At the foot of the cross. Some of the roughest language that Jesus uses is about greed. We might look and we might say, well, I'm not greedy. Whoa. Here's a guy who just says, hey, tell my brother to give me my inheritance. It's mine. I deserve it. And what does Jesus do? He gives them a lesson on greed. Fathers, we come to you today. We come to you as a people who you have incredibly, incredibly blessed. And we want to thank you for it. Lord, I pray that there's not any sense of guilt for the blessings that God has poured out and bestowed upon us. I pray that there's not any sense of oh no, I shouldn't have this, but to rejoice and to enjoy the blessings that you've given to us, because you have, God. You have blessed us in such remarkable ways. But check our hearts. Check our hearts. Help us to know, Lord, that this is on loan to us from God. And to whom much is given, much is required. We'll give an accounting for it. But more than that, Lord, begin with our heart, begin with our life. May we put our life on the altar for you. May everything we have and everything we are be used to bring glory to your name, that we might enjoy all that you've given to us. And Lord, those who might be struggling with finances, who might be struggling through a difficult time and finding that they're wanting and desiring and wishing that they had more wealth and so forth to make life easier for them, God, let them put their trust in you. Let them see their wealth in Jesus Christ. Let them have their confidence that you will provide everything that's needed. Lord, begin with our heart. May we realize we need more than anything else the saving grace of Jesus Christ to change us, to mold us, to make us like you. I pray these things in